Okay, everyone, welcome to week 4, day 1. Today we're talking about price floors, when price floors are binding, and the trade-offs that policymakers face when deciding whether or not to use price controls, such as price floors or price ceilings. Um, these slides aren't quite as updated as some of the other ones due to the Super Bowl being last night and I'm moving a little slow today, but they're still pretty good. So, motivation uh, for this section, you need to read pages 45 and 48. The section title names are quantity supplied need not equal quantity demanded and price floor. So, why do price controls matter? They're often discussed in the discourse on economic policies. So, they're one of the most ubiquitous economic policies that policymakers often play with. They like to control prices, whether that be constraining them to a low number or keeping them artificially high. And these policies have consequences for the well-being of consumers and producers. And the policies that are most commonly thought of as being a price floor is the minimum wage, which is a huge debate right now, and people have expressed interest in this. So I'll get to that a little bit today, and then what the frontier of research looks like currently and the other price control that policymakers often uses a price ceiling, and that's often associated with rent control. So the justifications for these policies are they're typically argue that they're going to make prices more fair for somebody. Now, fair is not a positive economic concept; it's normative. It requires a judgment statement, and so fair meaning that it makes prices better or for some person, whether that be a business or a consumer. And importantly, because goods are scarce, keeping a price artificially high or artificially low does not remove the need to ration them to the people who want the goods the most. And so goods have to still be rationed in some way. And this is kind of the pushback for using price controls is that it keeps prices from being able to signal to buyers and sellers what or how much of a good they should be purchasing. Anyway, so uh, a price control is just a regulation on the price of transactions in a market. And it's pretty easy to depict it in our price quantity plan that we've been working with so far. So a price control is just a horizontal line. It can be depicted as just a horizontal line. And right now, this price control could be a minimum wage or a price ceiling or a rent control. We haven't uh, figured out what we're doing with it yet. Both are depicted by this horizontal black line. So let's start with a price floor. So now this black line is a price floor. And so what it does is it keeps the price from going below this black bar. And so it makes sure that P is greater than whatever the price floor is set as. And so this control is a price floor where all the prices above it are legally allowed by the legislation or the law. So on the opposite hand, and what I'll talk about in the day 2 is a price ceiling. So price ceilings keep a price legally from going above some, or yeah, from going above some black line. So it ensures that P is less than whatever the ceiling is. And so all these, if this black bar represents a price ceiling, then all the orange prices are legally allowed to be prices set like by the market. So an important distinction to make, and I'm going to make this point in our theoretical labor market here, is we're going to assume that this market is competitive, and that's very important for kind of the frontier of research and where it's at right now that I'll discuss at the end. But for now, assume our market is competitive, and there's some minimum wage that's set at WF, and there's a price floor at WF. So legally, prices are not allowed to go below this black line, which is a wage, and we need to know, does it matter for the equilibrium outcome in the market? So we're interested in whether or not this price floor binds. For it to bind, it means it has to influence the price and keep it from moving to the equilibrium price that we would expect to see in the absence of any government intervention. So suppose there is a minimum wage and in this market, and we want to know, does this black minimum wage line or price floor bind? And for these two curves, for this supply curve and this demand curve, this is an unbinding price floor because the price floor is keeping the price from going down below it, but the price is already above the price floor even without that legislation. So this is an unbinding price floor. The negotiation between buyers and sellers will move this price in the market towards equilibrium, regardless of whether this price floor is set or not. And so what I'm saying is, you could take this price floor out and it wouldn't affect the market. You could put it back in and it still wouldn't affect the market. However, for this price floor where it's above the equilibrium in a market, there's a different conclusion. It's a binding price floor. And the reason for that is it keeps the wage from going below what we've set as the minimum wage or the price floor, and in this example. And so what happens is negotiation between buyers and sellers can't move this wage below this price floor. And now we're going to kind of look at what the consequences of that are. So this is a lot of text over here, but what we see essentially is that this gray dot is the quantity demanded in the market, and this yellow dot is the quantity supplied. So because the wage is higher than the equilibrium wage, more people want to work, but less jobs exist because employers are not interested in hiring that many people if they have to pay more than they would at the equilibrium wage. And so what we get is there's a surplus of workers, which is, in other words, in regular you know, talk, is there's surplus workers in the market. And that's due to this minimum wage. So, why does the price control lead to unemployment? After all, it is intended to help people. Why does a minimum wage cause unemployment? It's because altering the price has not changed any factors underlying supply and demand. There's still scarcity, there's still constraints. Businesses don't magically have cheaper inputs now or anything like that, and it has not altered the slope of the line. So supply and demand haven't shifted. They haven't rotated, making the slopes more or less elastic. And so, despite the good intentions to make prices more affordable or to pay people more, it hasn't changed any of the underlying determinants of supply and demand in the market. And so, what we'll show in kind of these next slides is that price floors have ambiguous effects on the sellers, which are the workers in this market, and they hurt the buyers, which are the firms in this market. So, let's consider a competitive labor market. And like I said, it's important that we're assuming a competitive market here that's adequately described by a supply and demand. So the total surplus is represented by all the transactions that mutually benefit both consumers and producers, which is represented by this gray triangle. And so W star is the equilibrium wage, and it splits because this is the wage that we expect to see in the market, is splitting the surplus into both consumer and producer surplus. And the below the minimum or the equilibrium wage is the producer surplus, and it's just the producer surplus is just the price received above the cost of production. That is, if you'd be willing to work at this wage, but you actually receive this wage, then a measure of your well-offness is the difference between what you actually get and what you would have required to get to come to work. And so that's represented by the gold triangle, and then the consumer surplus is represented by the dark gray triangle. So if a business, would be willing to pay you this much, but they only have to pay you the equilibrium wage, then the consumer surplus or a value of or a measure of how well off the business is from hiring someone is how much they would have been willing to pay minus the price they actually had to pay. And so we know that the equilibrium point maximizes the sum of these two triangles. So let's examine how minimum wage would affect the surplus in the market, and starting from a efficiency of competitive equilibrium. Well, first we have a price floor that's imposed in this market at WF, which is greater than the W star, so the equilibrium wage. So we know that this minimum wage or price floor is binding. And so the quantity demanded falls from this orange dot, the Q star, to Q2. And what happens is because the wage that you're receiving is higher, you would have more producer surplus for the people who are employed, or you'd be better off. But there are people who are unemployed, so we don't know what the net effects are, because for all these people who become unemployed, they lose producer surplus and consumer surplus. And we know that consumer surplus falls, sorry for the typo, back to this gray box when it was this whole, or gray triangle when it was this whole gray triangle. So uh, we can't unambiguously say that producers are better off because they have lost some surplus, and it matters what this triangle compared to this rectangle that they gained are, depending on what the elasticities are. And so there is still lost surplus, which is also called deadweight loss. And so this is how the OpenStax book defines these areas of surplus and how they change. And so once the minimum wage gets put in, you lose triangle J and triangle K. And H goes from being consumer surplus to producer surplus. And if you want to read more about it, it's on page 67 and 74 of the textbook. You can click right here. So anyway, there could be non-price reactions in the market though. So when you go to a minimum wage, you know that you have to report, for tax purposes, who you're and how much you're paying. So by enacting a minimum wage, it makes under the table work, that is where you have no taxes reporting, you just get some cash on the side from your uncle for helping him move or something. It makes that more attractive on the margin. Not saying all work becomes that way. I'm just saying that if you were being paid the minimum wage and now uh, an employer would not keep you on if they had to pay you more, well, then they'll just maybe move to paying you under the table. Anyway, it might cause outsourcing of jobs, so it increases the incentives to send work to places where there isn't a minimum wage. And it might also cause automation of jobs because it increases the incentives to automate jobs. Like when you have like a McDonald's machine that you're ordering from, those are much more prominent in Europe where there's a higher minimum wage. So you have these other non-price adjustments that could also result from a minimum wage being enacted. But on the other hand, minimum wage has been shown to reduce income inequality. So there are some equality benefits, although the equality benefits might come at the cost of efficiency. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to click on this research article and read about kind of what this has found. And then also, this is a really important point, the competitive market predictions rely on a competitive market, which assumes many potential employers or buyers. And in a lot of smaller towns, it's not realistic to think that there's more than one employer. And then we have a situation called monopsony, not monopoly, where there's one seller. Now there's just one buyer of workers. And so relaxing the assumption of a competitive market changes the predictions of the model. And that's what I want to get into in the discussion board, not this week, but next week. And so we're going to have a good discussion about the minimum wage where I have you read stuff. But for now, that's all I have to say about the minimum wage. So thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the second set of slides.